Well, hello there, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. James Hilliard here with you, host for this event, and cybersecurity really is front and center for today's conversation. A couple of things that we're going to talk about here today. We're going to touch on definitely the current security landscape and the threats impacting all of us. I know social engineering is going to find its way into the conversation, and also going to share some best practices about how all of us, how all of you can combat the threats out there. And we'll touch on some tech. Part of the tech we'll talk about some of those secure HPE compute solutions that are available in the marketplace, many of the newest ones built with AMD's third generation EPYC 7003 series processor. A little more on that later on. Excited to have two special guests joining us in a little while. Kevin Mitnick, famed hacker and current security expert. Also James Morrison on board. He is currently with HPE, formerly with another three-letter organization, FBI, and we'll hear more about his background in a little bit. Also joined, as you see with me here, Greg Abbott is kicking things off with me, Senior Solutions Architect at Tech Power Solutions. And Greg, appreciate your time here today. Before we get into the conversation with Kevin and James, I want to get really kind of your perspective and thoughts on some of the Tech Power customers that you're talking to, and wanted to really kick it off at a high level. As you and your team are engaging with those customers, what are they saying to you when it comes to security? Like top 2 or 3 concerns, issues, worries that are keeping them up at night?
Yeah, there's one that's on top of everybody's mind, and that's the phishing attacks that are hitting pretty much every organization. We have seen external emails coming in that look like they're coming from officers or the president of the company, and it's really hard not to want to respond quickly to those, right? And so that's the big problem that our customers are seeing. As they express to us, they're one click away from a major problem. And with so many novice users and new users, that it's really hard for companies to stay on top of that.
Do you recall, and I'll take you, I got my first Nigerian scam email years ago, and I was like, okay, that's fake. And I used to pride myself thinking, Greg, that, man, you give me 10 phishing emails and I'll be able to pick out 9 of them, right? The logos were wrong. It was the wrong font and this and that. I don't think I would bet you any money right now because they've gotten so good. They're so convincing. And you're right. Looks legit. You just want to click on it.
Right. Yeah. When they look like they're coming from internal, we've had customers telling us about that. It's not even a goofy email address. It looks like somebody internal. So yeah, we got to be very proactive with your how you respond to that.
Yeah, how you respond to it. And also, I see all too often on just social media, even it's creeping in a little more to the LinkedIn world where it's a little more professional, but on the other social media platforms, you'll see things like, hey, take your birth month and your last name, and there's your 4th of July name, or there's your, St. Patrick's Day name or leprechaun name or something. You've just given people either where you were born and raised, favorite color, and those are all the passwords that people need to and use to get into systems, right?
Exactly. Yeah. We're all seeing that, right? And you see those emails go out or those messages go out, and you think, no, don't answer that. And you see your friends answering, no, don't do that.
Yeah. No, yeah, there are a couple people I've had to educate saying, stop spreading these, don't share that, don't, but, and some are like, wow. And I think that goes to one of the big things. And let me ask you this, and then I got a couple other things I want to share with you before we get to our feature conversation, but education. It seems like more and more when I talk in your team, right, at Tech Power, part of your job is turning into that education role of trying to help the technology teams you work with educate their end users to not make some of these silly mistakes.
Right. We have several customers who regularly do tests. I know this is a common practice, who regularly do tests and rate their own users. And, they're constantly doing the facepalm, 8 out of or 2 out of 10, you can just guarantee are going to click whatever you send them, and you penalize them, you make them go through training, and it doesn't help, right? So the organizations have to have fail-safe mechanisms in place, or the ability to quickly respond when hacks do happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sure we'll get into that a bit later, and I'll raise that with Kevin and with James. Let me bring up something else, and this is that executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. I'm not asking you to break it down. One, it's a long document. Two, people need to do that on their own. The reason I want to bring it up to you is an executive order. I mean, that's at the highest level, and ultimately is saying, look, we need to be sharing some more information. The federal government, private industry, companies need to come together and need to kind of have a focused go-to market plan to combat cybersecurity issues out here. So my question to you is, in terms of that communication, how important do you see that as more and more, whether it's just internal industry groups coming together, partners like you and the HPEs coming together, the federal government coming, everyone having to get more or less on a similar page to combat all the cybersecurity threats?
Right. Yeah. Obviously, it's really concerning when you hear of outside hostile organizations reaching in, and it's not a secret anymore, right? And it's very concerning. I like the idea of a centralized 911 type of ransomware reporting tool or agency that's able to respond and assist with companies, because when those events happen, it's an emergency right away, right? It doesn't. It's a major problem very quickly for companies.
There's a lot of reaction. I'm going back to, you were just saying that, companies test, and this is one of those other things. I think the idea of testing your disaster recovery and backup, and disaster recovery doesn't just mean that hurricane anymore that flooded a data center, right? It can be these actions, either nation states, these rogue organizations that are out there. I mean, that's a disaster as well. And then we also saw what happened when COVID came on. I mean, that was not, no, people had planned for maybe some cyber attacks. People had planned for some natural elements, fires, hurricanes. No one thought a world pandemic was coming down the line, right? And that did catch a lot of people surprised. So definitely that working together with those bigger organizations is definitely something that is going to take some time, but is getting some steam behind it. What do you see of your Tech Power customers working together internally to break down those silos, more and more sharing information within the groups of the organization, again, so that the whole organization can have a security posture? Is that happening?
Some are. The bigger companies are doing that. Smaller companies are always stressed, with resources, and it's more of an emergency reaction type of capability. But one of the things that we're doing with customers is we're helping create a backup and DR plan with a restore capability that will get them out of trouble quickly. We've actually called it our ransomware buster solution, and we're partnering with HP using StoreOnce and Cloud Volumes along with Veeam for solutions again scaled between SMB and enterprise. So that'll help create, number one, create the awareness, but also give them a plan that they can execute to get out of trouble quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. No, folks, I'll share information at the end of the event here today, where you can get more information about Tech Power, and of course you can get more information about that offering there. Let me ask you this, and we'll jump into our future conversation here in just a moment. But one of the last things I want to get an idea from you is, the world has changed that we work in, and no longer is everything just within the four walls of our organization, right? That footprint has grown. This hybrid work environment is here now. Many people, I believe, here to stay. Are you seeing your customers out there planning for that? Is that a big topic of conversation, of them realizing that we're going to have more people working remotely than we did before, but we're going to have some people back in the office, and we need to focus on how we secure all that in a different manner?
Absolutely. And that's been a discussion throughout the year, right? I think a year ago, gosh, the time has flown by, right? That's the fastest year ever. Immediately people went remote. For us and everybody that we're working with, the move to remote was very quick, and so now it's a question of how many people come back, and is the old normal coming back, or the combination. So yeah, it's ongoing conversation. It's happening all the time. People are realizing they need to update. They put a patchwork solution in, and now they're realizing, oh, this is going to be a while. And so their upgrades and their new plans all include the remote workers and making that a more stable, long-term type of solution.
Greg, really appreciate you kicking things off here with me and some of those insights here. I'm going to have you hang tight. We're going to come back to you with some final thoughts in a little bit, but we're going to take the next half hour or so to jump on into our featured conversation with two of our guests here. I'm going to start off with James Morrison. He joins us from HPE. He is a distinguished technologist. He loves when I use that term. He's a security expert. I've had a chance to talk with him many times and get some good insights, and he has a real good feel of what's going on in the current security landscape. I mentioned he worked at the Bureau, the FBI, so we'll get a little more detail on that. But James, first off, just want to welcome you and thank you for chatting with us again.
Good to see you as well, James. Yeah, the distinguished technologist is kind of a strange term. Being in the government for as long as I was, I'm not sure what it means, but I just keep talking security and hope that I'm doing the right thing, right?
I think you are, and I always enjoy the conversations, learn something new. And folks, also on board, Kevin Mitnick is here, the world's most famous hacker. He is turned into a New York Times bestselling author. He is a trusted information security and hacking specialist. I've had a chance to talk to Kevin over the years, and Kevin, good to see you again as well.
Excellent to be here, James.
I had mentioned a few minutes ago with our audience here that we were going to spend about 25 or 30 minutes talking with the two of you. We're going to definitely talk about the security landscape. I'm also going to lay out a bunch of terms that I like. If we had a bingo board, I bet people could be marking things off. Social engineering, pen testing, zero trust, offense, defense. Those are all some of the concepts and ideas that we're going to get into in terms of security. And we will do, folks, a little bit of tech talk. As I had mentioned, we'll talk about some of the secure HPE compute solutions out there. Many of them, again, built on AMD's third generation EPYC 7003 series processor. What I want to do, though, is dive into a little bit more of a background on these guys. And James, I'm going to start with you. I had mentioned these three-letter companies you work for, HPE now, but FBI before. What were you doing at the Bureau in terms of cybersecurity?
So what the Bureau did is they realized back in about 2012 that the crime was becoming more high tech. And the agents were doing a great job, but they were finding themselves a little challenged by, the new networks and the new operating systems and all of these new attack vectors that were coming in. And so they started hiring both internal and external computer scientists to be the technical leads and to work these cases. The target attack really was this beginning of a change from nation states to more organized crime elements. Sadly, it turned out that they were ahead of the game because we started to see ransomware popping up in 13 and 14 and becoming extremely prolific. And really now what we're in is the industrialization of cybercrime and the growth of things like the dark web and cryptocurrency and it's really ripe, unfortunately, for this rise of cybercrime. I think I saw a statistic that said there are 7 U.S. companies hit by ransomware every hour right now, and it's out of control. It's very crazy. So my job was to take apart the malware. I did reverse engineering of malware to try to determine the source and purpose of that code. I was also a trainer. I did instruction for the Bureau, teaching cybercrime and cyber investigations for various groups. And then at the end, I was a tactical resource for the local cyber task forces here in the Houston area. Getting that evidence, putting that evidence into an understandable way for a jury or for a U.S. attorney to be able to know. They don't know IP addresses and they don't know all that stuff. So I've got to put it in words that they understand so that they can write it up. So that was kind of where I ended up with my career. And then I retired about 18 months ago and joined HPE.
And you've been out there, and we'll hear a lot more about kind of what you're doing with the HPE now. But again, out there helping folks understand where these security threats are, talking about what is out there from HPE and their partners in terms of how we can secure. So we'll get more into that. Kevin, let's move over to you. Let's do a little background here. Again, the world's most famous hacker. I was a reporter in the late 90s and knew about you. And so let's do this for folks that are not familiar. Let's go on the Wayback Machine. take us to the 90s, talk a little bit about that hacking background, and then bring us to today, right? What you're doing now. And then let's take a couple minutes to kind of break that down.
It actually goes further back to actually the 1970s. When I first got started in hacking, it was for my love of magic. So as a young boy, I used to be fascinated with magic. Then eventually in high school, I met this kid who could do magic with a telephone system, and he was called a phone phreaker. And he had all these really cool tricks, like I can call on one number, he can call on another, we'd be magically joined. And he also was very adept. And this is the first time I was introduced to this, into the technique of social engineering, where he knew the terminology, he knew the lingo of the phone company, and was able to call certain departments, and they believed who you were based on the knowledge of having their phone number. And he was able to sweet talk them out of anything, unlisted phone numbers, the cable and pair that's assigned to a phone number that might be going to your home or your business. And this just fascinated me. And I was like really sucked into this. And I was a prankster. I love pulling pranks. I was into amateur radio. And one of my favorite pranks was to change my friend's parents' home phone to a pay phone. So whenever the parents tried to make a call, it'd say, please deposit 25 cents. So I just love this type of stuff. And I became, really, I would say, addicted to playing with this technology. So then I realized the phone company was going, more towards from electromechanical switching to electronic switching. And that's where I wanted to become more adept at gaining access to these computers to pull better pranks on friends and family and gain more control of the phone company, because it was like a puzzle to be solved. And this is where I first got started in hacking. And my target was all the phone companies in the United States and in some places like Great Britain and Australia and this sort of thing. And then I got myself into a lot of hot water, right? So James was the guy, his team was chasing me. Well, not him, but his colleagues were chasing me around the world trying to find out my location, because I was stepping on a lot of toes. Even though I wasn't doing this to make a profit, I wasn't doing this to cause harm, I was still breaking the law. I was still upsetting a lot of these companies because they had to investigate these intrusions, and they didn't know who was on the other side. They could have been, a nation state. It could have been a group of industrial spies. They didn't know. So I made a lot of people nervous, I'm sure, back in my day. But fortunately, there's been a great transition. It's kind of like making lemonade out of lemons. In the year 2000, I was still on probation, by the way. And this is where I was allowed by the government to write my first book on social engineering called The Art of Deception. And I started up my security testing company in 2004. So it's quite interesting if you think about it, James, because my hacking was illegal back, in the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s. And now I'm in 2000, and now I open up a company to actually hack, right? So how can you do this? It's a criminal offense. Well, there's one word that changes the whole paradigm, and that's authorization. So my clients give me authorization. We get to practice all the tradecraft, myself, my team. And then what we're looking for is we're looking for gaps in security controls. So we could report that to our clients so they could shore up those defenses before the real bad guys find them. And so it's been a fantastic journey. Again, I took the hard road. I didn't go through the university system and, get a degree in information security. I don't encourage anyone to ever follow in my footsteps, by the way. It was a very difficult time for myself and my family. Mm-hmm. But today I operate a security testing company. I'm also the chief hacking officer of a company called KnowBe4. And KnowBe4 is the largest information security training company in the world. And what we try to do there is help users make smarter decisions, right? Through security awareness training and also simulated phishing. So it's kind of interesting. I get to wear the offensive hat at Mitnick Security. And then at KnowBe4, I wear that defensive hat, trying to help businesses not get fooled through social engineering tradecraft. And like you said, I wrote some books. I'm on the public speaking circuit. And it's really just a fantastic field to be in. And this all started, again, from my love of magic.
Well, I was going to say, Kevin, I of course followed you along the way. I'm an ethical hacker, right? So that's the term, right? Certified ethical hacker, and I teach cybersecurity, and I bring up the case because it's an interesting case for how from the early hacking standpoints. And so I tell every company, have you had a penetration test? Are you training your people? And so I will say know before often comes up as a company to talk to about those particular episodes, because it is the world. Cybersecurity is a great phase, a great place to be in, and that's why even HPE, even though we're somewhat known as a server company, we have cybersecurity bodies internal, because we find ourselves having those security conversations with customers, and we want to be able to start those conversations and help them get to a much better solution. So we're all kind of working together towards that.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about security, there's so many things the customer has to think about, from the hardware to the software to applications to how users interact with their systems that they're using. And there's just so many different components of keeping the company secure and locking down their infrastructure, if you will, that if a company just misses one of these, that's where we have bad results. Look at Colonial Pipeline. They had a password in a data breach, and and for those that don't know, companies get breached. These databases end up in the public domain. You have bad actors that aggregate all these data breaches that contained hash passwords, plain text passwords. If they're hashed, they crack them. They enrich the data, and unfortunately, there are a lot of companies where they have legacy credentials there that bad actors could abuse, and also people usually pick the same patterns, right? So if you're looking at a particular company and you're looking at the users of how they think, right? How are they constructing their credential? It's not it's not difficult for a bad actor to figure out the pattern, and if they're using that same pattern, it could be a problem.
Well, that's what it's a good point, because I mean, you're absolutely right. Password security, and that was when we started talking about hardware security, right? So one of the things we did when we created the Silicon Root of Trust was we put a software package over the top that made sure we could check those passwords. So that's something that's built into our security, is to make sure that they're not using easy passwords or passwords that are duplicated. And we don't think about that at that hardware level of, if somebody gained physical access to my server, what could they do? They could log into my management interface. They could, but now management interfaces are being plugged in remotely, right? So you're plugging these things into an IP address. So that same security issue becomes a constant. So I think it's we keep going back to the person. The person is that weakest link, and we have to continue to think about what could they do, and then somehow make sure the technology sort of helps us get to a better solution, even if they make a mistake.
Yeah, that's really concerning, especially when we're dealing with hardware implants and bad actors backdooring firmware, because you could reinstall the operating system once, twice, 10 times. And if the bad actor has an implant in the firmware, it's essentially game over. So it's really important to think at the hardware level all the way up the chain to what I like to call layer 8, which is the human being.
Right. Well, so yeah, I mean, as an ethical hacker, and you and I are on the same page, they have three things they're trying to do. They want to gain sysadmin rights, right? They want to escalate their privileges. They want to move laterally through the network, and they want persistence. And we've seen repeatedly, and Microsoft actually put out a report earlier this year about persistence in the firmware and how that was going to be an increasing attack surface. And so when we built our servers, one of the things that we wanted to do is make sure that we had that security all the way from the base up. So we create our own silicon. We don't buy it from anybody. HP makes its own. We put a fingerprint for every one of our servers, and then that fingerprint becomes an indelible mark and an immutable signature all the way through the boot process, or we can even do it while the server's running. And then we also, AMD came out with their new processors. We wanted to make sure that we had better security by tying into their security features. So they have some encryption built into the servers or into their processors that we wanted to make sure that so it's kind of that we kind of scratch each other's back there, right? So they're encrypting the data, but we're making sure that their processor hasn't been messed with before, by someone, on a firmware or hardware attack.
Yeah, because that's definitely a typical tradecraft of nation state is get into the secure boot process. When you're doing that remote management on the firmware, is there an option to add 2FA?
So there is. There is a multi-factor authentication possible as well. We want to make sure we can add in additional security all along the way. So we did what we call Silicon Root of Trust 4 years ago now, 2017, and we're just continuing to enhance it as we go forward. So I think there's some really good conversation there. And what I tell people, and this is kind of coming back to it, is even before you talk to us, though, you want to make sure you're having a pen test done, right? I mean, shouldn't somebody be coming into your network to show what the vulnerabilities are? I mean, I've talked to companies that say they're still using like Windows XP, and you're like, wait a second. I mean, this is not even supportable anymore, right? But they're just not, they're not having those conversations at a very basic level. And I think that's just, it's just sort of I think there's some complacency that comes up from it, or they say, well, it's a budgetary issue, or they just assume the risk. And I think, unfortunately, that like with Colonial Pipeline, I think is a good example where they had a old username, user account on a VPN with no multi-factor authentication that this person was able to log in and do, at least scare them and do a lot of reputational damage to the company.
Yeah, I realize that. And why I was asking about 2FA, by the way, is when we're doing security tests, we're usually very successful at compromising the admins, the people in the organization that have the keys to the kingdom. And I'm involved in a pen test right now of a pretty sizable business. And there's actually the ILO credentials to manage their products that are actually in their password manager. And I was going, wow, that's quite interesting. So that's why I think even at the hardware level, when you're dealing with remote management, that 2FA is necessary. And with pen testing, I think pen testing is absolutely necessary, because how do you know what weaknesses are in your security controls? How do you know that your network services aren't exploitable? What about your web applications? We find a lot of businesses that have internet-facing web applications, and they're not written well. And they give our engineers an opportunity to find what we call RCEs. That's the most coveted remote code execution.
Right.
So we could actually, from the web application, find a remote code execution vulnerability, get a footprint on that server or a foothold on that server, and then laterally move to other systems within the organization. And that all depends on segmentation. And when we talk about segmentation, James, a lot of companies run it flat. They have a flat network, which gives our team the ability to laterally move and compromise other assets. And not only from an application perspective, but network perspective. I was recently testing a very well-known retailer, and they had a wireless network in all the retail stores. They still use the older technology of pre-shared keys, not 802.1x. And the credential that we found later, by the way, in the pen test was extremely difficult. We wouldn't be able to crack it. The typical tradecraft bad actors use is they capture the four-way handshake during the connection from the supplicant, which is the user's machine, to the AP, the access point, and they were able to capture that traffic and get enough details to run a tool like a cracking tool, and usually with multiple GPUs. But it's extremely slow when you're dealing with wireless. But we got lucky because this particular retailer had multiple APs, and one of their APs, the password was super simple, and it was cracked in a very short time. And the funny thing is I have security engineers all over the world, and we did this at a mall in Florida, right? So we're thinking, wow, we can't sit there in the mall all day, or sit there. There was a coffee shop that was pretty close by. So what we actually did in this case, and you have to think about Ocean's 11, is we weaponized a Raspberry Pi, and there was a seating area within a close proximity of the retail outlet. And we had the Raspberry Pi do an open VPN connection to one of our servers. And so the whole team from all around the world was able to go through the Pi that was associated with their wireless network and actually do the pen test for about a month. So this Pi was actually hidden under a table where people were eating, and they had their own electrical outlets, and it was actually plugged into the AC power. And we set it up in such a way, not even the cleaning crew of this mall ever found it in a month. So once we're over with the pen test, we removed it. But you have to think about wireless vulnerabilities. You have to think about all the different vectors that bad actors could exploit to get a foothold on that network, laterally move, escalate privileges, and then find the data. Why are they there? They're usually there to steal data.
Well,
right?
I think you brought up a good point there. I mean, so statistically, 40% of data on networks is insecure, right? So, and that's just internal people. So now we're seeing with ransomware, we're seeing it go into this double extortion, where they're actually going to steal your data, and use that data against you. I mean, it seems to me like we should be in a world where we're encrypting data much more than we are and using data protection mechanisms, but we're still not there. And I find that kind of confusing sometimes, because that's something that we've been building in as well, as the idea of self-encrypting drives, for example. A lot of our servers we can actually put in our storage devices. We can do self-encrypting drives, or we encrypt the memory. So one of the things with the AMD processor is that the RAM, when the data is written to the RAM, it's automatically encrypted. So if somebody even stole that server, they couldn't do anything with it. Or encrypting the virtualization engine. So now the VMs and all of the containers and all that world are all encrypted, just because we don't know. I mean, you kind of alluded to it. I don't know who has some sort of persistent, network connection, and I don't want to give it to them for free at a minimum, right? I want to make sure that I'm making technology work in my favor and not really against me, like your Raspberry Pi issue.
Right, and when you're talking about virtual machines, I'm thinking about most companies today that we're testing do have virtual environments. And sometimes we only get access to the guest. We don't have access to the host because we haven't gotten there yet. And then we're thinking, how can we jump from one VM to the other? So then when you're thinking about, side channel attacks, where you're trying to exploit the hypervisor to gain access to the memory of the other guest,
Yep.
right? And so that's definitely a technique that bad actors use. It's somewhat sophisticated. And in a lot of cases, you don't really have to go to all those efforts. Once you're on the inside, it's almost like most companies really spend most of their time thinking about external hacking.
Yep.
People coming into the organization remotely, but once you're inside the organization, now some are really good at mitigating risk, like have really good segmentation, but others leave everything on network file shares. I mean, I can't tell you how many times in organizations we tested that they have all the privileged passwords sitting there on unencrypted Excel spreadsheets on the IT drive.
Yep.
On the IT drive, right? And that's the first place a bad actor is going to look, is where's the IT drive? Where are the guys that are supporting the network? Where are they starting their documentation? Yeah.
And I just saw this. I actually just saw an article. I was reading it today. An internal person was working with a ransomware company to help, launch attacks against their corporation. So we can't ignore that insider, right? And we just can't. And I mean, I think the other thing you bring up is the idea we're in a speed world now too, right? Everything's faster. Back in the day, I learned how to program, taught myself to program back in the 80s, and 2K of RAM, right? Now we're in this world with hyper speeds, and that's something that was one of the relationships we built with AMD as well, is because their processors were faster, and we know that that's the world we live in. And so because of that speed, it's 39% faster or better performance than anything else on the market. And that's just the world. That's just the continuing market we're living in now. So I think in cloud environments, VM environments, we just have to think that way and think about the speed of motion. So.
Yeah, and when you think about it, I started, and you won't believe this, James, maybe it's before your time, I don't know, 110 baud, 10 characters per second, right?
In my Air Force time, we still had 60 baud circuits and 75 baud circuits. So we were doing teletypes back in the day. So my first modem was, I think, a 64 or something, or 24, the 24K modem. So yeah.
Yeah. So when you're talking about the speed, think about the speed of exfiltration. Back when I was hacking, it would take 2 full days non-interrupted connection to exfiltrate 50 megabytes. Which is nothing today. Today, when a bad actor gets in the organization to bypass DLP processes, they'll encrypt the data, they'll set it up in such a way, use protocols to move the data, maybe something like SSH. They won't use TLS much because companies are getting smarter and using TLS terminate. They're using like on an F5 where you do your SSL termination and you can get visibility into what's being sent. You get packet inspection there. So nowadays, what companies have to be concerned about when they have a bad actor get in, they need to detect that bad actor very quickly, because if they don't do it, the data could be gone already. And when you're thinking about ransomware attacks today, the bad actors are not just encrypting those files anymore, because they realize that some companies have good disaster recovery processes and can restore that data. So what they're doing is, as you mentioned before, they're stealing the data. And then if you don't pay X amount of Bitcoin or Monero or whatever they want, they're going to release that data publicly. So now
that's why I think JBS, they said that's why they paid. JBS paid, I think it was $11 million
Yep.
And they said because they didn't want the data, released. So it absolutely is. That's the double extortion. Then we're seeing the triple extortion now too, where they're going to put your name out on a website and embarrass you, or they're going to contact all of your customers and say, hey, this group's been hacked. You shouldn't do business with them. And I even saw a fourth layer of that where they're looking for pictures that might be compromising pictures of people inside of that company. And then they're going to threaten to, so they're going to go after individuals and try to compromise them. So we really do live in a world of speed. And I think one statistic I saw, which was fascinating, is that by 2025, we will be storing 175 zettabytes of data annually. And when you look at that massive amount of data, how are we securing it? We got a lot of people pushing data into the cloud. Are you securing it in the cloud, right? Are we keeping that data secure and wherever it's being stored? And so one of the conversations we have is that, data exists in 3 states. It exists at rest. So we got the data, on hard drives. It exists in flow, in motion. That's why things like TLS and IPsec. And then the third one, which was always a challenge, that exists in use. And so we wanted to make sure we could secure it while it's in RAM and while it's in cache and while it's in all of those things, because we know that the data is the world we live in. The criminal wants your data. And if I was going to say one thing I want everybody to understand is know that the world we live in, it's about data security and it's about workflow security. And so you have to start thinking that way and thinking that's what they're going to come after in the end.
100%. Data is where it's at, because bad actors are not usually going to steal data at rest. They know it's encrypted. We have TLS, we have different protocols, SSH, to protect that data when it's in transit. It's when that data is being used by an application. So typically when we're doing a security assessment and we want to get to encrypted data, let's say a company is processing credit cards internally, what we'll do as part of the pen test is we'll look at the application has to have visibility into the data. How's the application able to decrypt that data and use it in the business? So then what we'll do is we'll go chase that down, that process down, and we'll find where they're retrieving the key. Unfortunately, a lot of those keys are in stored procedures in a SQL database, or in one case, there was a credit bureau that we tested years ago, and they actually had their keys to everything in a flat text file, right? So they're just in one place, right? And how we found that is we looked at the bash history of one of the admins, and we found the path to the key file, and it was the keys to everything. I mean, everything, right? So, you're absolutely right. When it comes to security, it's all about the data. Bad actors are now analyzing the processes inside the business to see what applications have access to that data, and that's where they steal it and exfiltrate it.
I want to ask you a question.
I guess we should let you talk here, right?
This is weird. I said we had those bingo words, and you guys covered like all the bingo words and went into depth. So it's been great. There's been no need for me to jump in, but I do. It's going to follow up on this idea of the speed and the pen test. And we've got about 5 more minutes here that we'll chat before we come back to our partners. The pen testing. How often do we have to do that now, Kevin? Because it seems like right when we might find some vulnerabilities, here are some new ones that we got to deal with. So, I mean, what's that look like for a lot of organizations today? How do we continue to stay ahead of the game?
I think using the SaaS model, looking at penetration testing companies that have a SaaS model where they're doing penetration testing as a service, so you're constantly being tested. Now, don't think a pen test is the same as a vulnerability assessment. So if you're using tools like Nessus, or you're using SaaS tools like Qualys, which are really good tools, by the way, I'm not knocking these tools, that's really going to find all the security vulnerabilities that bad actors could exploit. What you really need to do is think, what does your business do, right? Are you in finance? Are you a bank? Obviously, you're going to do more testing because of the more criticality, but there should be a process in place whenever a company does an update to an application that's internet facing. They need to have a process inside the business. First of all, for the internal development group that obviously would have to have education in secure coding practices, for them to first review the code, then have a third party review the code before they get released to the public. What we find is where most of the mistakes are made is on web applications, right? Where web applications are updated, maybe they just had a pen test, then they do I get this all the time, where companies, test us before our next major update. Oh, okay. Then we go ahead and test them. We report what we found. And then I'm worried because I'm going, wow, what happens if their update now has created new vulnerabilities that bad actors could exploit. So yeah, it's basically a life cycle that companies have to think about and schedule their pen testing. And if it could be only in a small area, it could be just in the web app side of whenever they release new code, that it's reviewed and tested. Because again, what we're trying to do is mitigate the risk that bad actors can exploit it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, you really hit on this thing of updates, right? I mean, so many of the attacks we see are still based upon rev control and config management and having good patch handling. People will, I mean, we saw some hospitals get hit a couple of years ago when they hadn't patched up Heartbleed, and they were still using SSL 1.0, and which had been known to be a vulnerability for over a year. When they got hit because they just didn't do that kind of an update. So, that's why what we try to do also is including some data analytics, right? So we have a thing that looks at rev control across the network to make sure that everybody's at the most recent rev, because it's hard. And it's really tough when you get in these large enterprises to know, well, what version's here and what version's here. And I mean, when I worked for the Air Force, I mean, we did all manually. We actually had to sit there and have a spreadsheet back in the good old days of Lotus 123. And have the versions of all of our software in place, and so that's just not the world we live in. It's too big, too complex. So we've got to look at things more like data analytics to also help us in those areas. And we've always said try to have at least one a year if it's maybe. But I mean, what's funny is the person that asks me that question most of the time, how often should I have it, hasn't had one in 5 years. That's too long. I'll tell you, that's too long. Maybe 1 year is too often, but 5 years is definitely too long. So, let's meet somewhere in the middle and do it.
No, I agree. And a quick story, I was hired to test an airline, and we found they had an F5. It was vulnerable to an old exploit where the private keys in all the F5 appliances were the same. So the security community figured that out quite a while ago. And we were able to get into the business through a SQL injection vulnerability. So now we're on the internal network. We go and try the F5, and unbelievably, at this airline, that bug still works. It goes into the report as a critical, red blinking bug. You need to fix this like today. Company hires us, airline again, 2 years later. 2 years. We get into a phishing attack. Get our initial foothold on the network. I just go into the F5. I know it's not going to work, right? But I tried anyway because it worked before. And unbelievably, they never patched it. Okay, now, pen testing for me is a business, but I do not like wasting my time. In other words, because I just don't feel like I'm not giving any value to the client. I'd rather spend my time giving value to businesses that are really in the business of protecting themselves. So I called my contact. I go, hey, you didn't patch the F5. That was the most critical vulnerability in my report from 2 years ago. Why? And he goes, my management wouldn't let me reboot the F5. I said, listen, I'm happy to do pen testing for you, but if you're not going to take my advice, why spend the money? And you know what? They never hired me again.
I
shot myself in the foot.
I talked yourself out of another contract.
Yeah. I was honest. I shot myself in the foot. Yeah.
Guys, let me do this. Again, the hardest part about talking to the two of you, really me listening to the two of you, is the fact that I want to listen for like another 6 hours because there's so much that we could do. But what we wanted to do here is surface so many ideas so that the folks that are listening can have these conversations internally at their organizations, right? And start focusing on what they need to do. So what I want to do is I want to do a 1 minute per each one of you as we wrap up the conversation due to time here. James, I'll start with you. Kevin, I'm going to give you the last word. But as we're moving forward, James, as companies, and we're moving into our hybrid world, and we know that we're going to have people working from home and working from anywhere and in the office and everything, what's one thing that you hope that most organizations will take as a piece of advice to get themselves more secure as they move forward?
I'm never a one person kind of person, one idea, but I'll give you some quick ones within my time. Incident response plan. Have one, test it, right? Backup recovery plan. Have it, test it. 75% of backups fail when you need it. Make sure you have backups that are air gapped off the network, or you're using a technology that simulates the same idea. modernization is not just about us tech companies trying to sell a new gadget. There are new security features built into a lot of the things that we do. So let's have that conversation. Don't just ignore it because you think we're trying to pump a product. Let's talk about security. Let's sit down and have a real honest conversation of where you're trying to go with your transformation. And then what do you think your security concerns are going to be? And then let's get there. If it's ransomware that bugs you, let's talk about it. Let's talk about ransomware avoidance, ransomware remediation, ransomware recovery, all of these things. But we've got to start with having that honest conversation. And like Kevin said, if I'm telling you what, if I'm saying, hey, here's an idea of what to do, can we at least consider it? I mean, I'd like to know, that you at least put it on the table and didn't and ignored it because of something, then just say, well, I can't afford that. Can you afford $11 million for ransomware? Because if your insurance is who you think is going to protect you from ransomware, that ship is sailing. Cyber insurance companies are taking it on the nose right now because of ransomware, and they're becoming less likely to cover you. So let's use technology, use training, and start getting ahead of this, because it's just not going to get any better as long as we're giving money to these criminals.
It is not. It is not. Kevin, bring us home. Take a minute here. What's something that you want to leave us with?
Well, first of all, James, I agree 100% with what you said. I mean, it's really where businesses fall flat, at least from our perspective of offensive security testing, is the little things. They're not doing adequate patch management. I just tested a client. They didn't patch Exchange. Not the newest Exchange vulnerability. There was one back where you had to have credentials to exploit this bug. And what we did is we did a credential harvesting fish, got one person's credentials, and then leveraged those credentials to exploit Exchange. And then we're dealing that we're already at a high privilege level. We're able to laterally move and compromise the entire business. Why did that happen? Bad patch management. They didn't do it. When we're doing our testing, password sprays are extremely successful. And I'm really surprised in today's world that we could compromise our clients through simple password sprays. And for those that don't know, a password spray is when you take common passwords like maybe summer 2021 with an exclamation point, maybe winter 2021, fall 2021, welcome 2021, with different symbols at the end. And we try that password against every user in the organization. How do we find all your users? We scrape it from LinkedIn. We don't have your email address, but we could use other resources to put it together and know the format. So we're doing a password spray against Office 365 or your internet-facing Exchange server, right? So companies fall flat, again, because they don't fix the little stuff. Patching, segmentation, password management. James brought up backups, which is critically important in mitigating ransomware. Really testing your external web apps and actually using secure development to do that. Training your developers in the secure coding lifecycle so they don't make those mistakes. And I believe what I could leave you with is test, harden, train. Test, security testing. Harden, reduce that attack surface. Configure your environment so bad actors have less opportunities to exploit the business. And finally, training, which I think is critical. This is layer 8. This is training your users that are making decisions every day and using your technology. And if they make that wrong decision, no matter how much money you spend on technology, you're going to leave yourself open to compromise.
Great stuff, Kevin and James. Really do appreciate both of you being on board here. Folks, before we wrap things up, I do want to jump on back to Greg Abbott again with us from Tech Power Solutions. And Greg, we heard Kevin and James just there talking a lot about the kind of tools and techniques that the folks are using to get into our system. Some of them very complex, as no doubt things have evolved, but also there's still cyber criminals using simple things, right, to attack all of us. But one of my takeaways is like all hope is not lost, right? We can fight this fight. We can be more secure. But let me ask you, as you do talk to your Tech Power customers out there, what are some immediate steps that you'd love to see them taking and engaging in that's going to help them be more secure, tomorrow than they were yesterday?
Right. Well, number one, we love the HP solutions, right? Because security is really first in their minds. And with the AMD processor, those elements that they bring to market, bring to bear, are just fantastic, right? So we're helping customers adopt those technologies and see how they fit into their scheme with the new services they have to bring up, as we talked about before, with the remote workers and all that. And then combining those basic hardware platforms with the software platforms, again, HP solutions around Store Once and Veeam, and that ransomware buster solution that I mentioned earlier. We'd love to talk with customers around that, because you can get your arms around this so that you can respond quickly, get back up and running quickly in case you do get hit, and keep on top of it. It's tough.
Do you get to take credit for the ransomware buster's name?
I wish I did. I kind of like that, but no, that was another one of our team members who came up with that.
All right. Well, it is a good one. It's memorable. Folks, if you want to learn about that, if you also want to learn more about how Tech Power Solutions can really help you with your most pressing security needs out there, of course, as Greg was just mentioning, they can talk to you for days about HP Compute Solutions. And again, as you've heard us talk about, many of those powered by those AMD EPYC 7003 series processors. So how do you reach out to Tech Power? Two ways: 425-979-3240, 425-979-3240 is a phone number. And then online, very simple, Tech Power USA, techpowerusa.com, and you can reach out to the team. On behalf of Kevin and James and Greg here as well, James Hilliard here. Thanks for joining us, folks. We wish you all safety. Hope you'll be well, and we do look forward to talking to you all down the road.